There is a question that historians do not like to answer directly, not because they cannot find the words, but because the words, once spoken out loud, collapse an entire framework that took centuries to construct. And frameworks that have been taught in universities and printed in textbooks and repeated by every documentary narrator you have ever heard, do not collapse quietly. The question is this: what if the civilization we call the Old World was not primitive? What if the engineers, the architects, the builders, the scientists who lived before the year 1850 were not slowly working their way up toward modern technology? What if they had already been there? What if they had already arrived? What if everything we were told about the birth of modern science was not a story of progress, but a story of recovery? You are about to hear 100 things, 100 technologies, 100 machines and systems and methods of power and light and heat and motion and construction that existed before the Industrial Revolution, supposedly invented everything from scratch, before Edison, before Watt, before the textbooks tell you the modern age began. Some of these things sit in museums right now, in glass cases with vague labels that say things like purpose, unknown, or ceremonial object. Some are documented in patent archives that nobody visits anymore. Some were photographed and measured and sketched by engineers in the 19th century who wrote in their field notes that they could not explain what they were looking at. And some were simply built into structures that are still standing today, still functioning in ways that no restoration project has ever claimed credit for. This is not a list of ancient curiosities. This is something more specific than that. This is a catalogue of what was lost. Not slowly, not through the gradual decay of centuries, but all at once, everywhere, across the same compressed window of decades. The mid-1800s, the period that the official story calls the dawn of the modern world, the period that a growing number of researchers, engineers, and historians who work outside the academic approval system are beginning to call the reset. You do not have to believe everything you hear tonight. You only have to listen, because the evidence is not going away. And the more of it you see, gathered in one place, the harder it becomes to explain using the old explanations. Find a comfortable position, let your eyes close if they want to, and stay with me for as long as you can. If this kind of content speaks to something in you, something that has always felt like the official story was missing pieces, leave a comment when you wake up. Tell me where you are watching from. And if you are new here, the subscribe button costs you nothing, and it means everything to a channel like this one. Now, let us begin. Number 1. Roman concrete. That has lasted 2,000 years. In the year 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius buried the city of Herculaneum under 30 meters of volcanic ash, it also preserved something that engineers in the 21st century are still trying to understand: the concrete. The Romans called it opus caementitium, and they used it for harbors, for breakwaters, for the foundations of buildings that sat permanently in seawater. Modern concrete begins cracking within decades in that kind of environment. The Roman version has been sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean for 2,000 years, and it is getting stronger. A team from the University of California, Berkeley, published a study in 2017, confirming that Roman marine concrete actually reinforces itself over time as seawater filters through the mixture and causes a mineral called tobermarite to crystallize within the structure. The Romans achieved this with volcanic ash from the region of Pozzuoli, combined with lime and seawater in a ratio that modern material scientists spent years attempting to reverse engineer. The formula was lost, not gradually. By the medieval period, the knowledge of how to produce pozzolanic concrete at the scale and quality the Romans had mastered was simply gone. Number 2. Greek fire and the secret that died with an empire. Sometime around the year 672 AD, A fleet of Arab ships attempting to besiege the city of Constantinople encountered something they had never seen and had no defense against. A weapon mounted on Byzantine warships began projecting a burning liquid across the water. The liquid did not go out when it hit the surface of the sea. It burned on water. It burned more intensely when water was thrown on it. It clung to wood, to rope, to the hulls of ships, and it could not be extinguished by any conventional means. The Arab fleet was destroyed. The weapon was called Greek fire, and it would defend Byzantium for the next 7 centuries. The formula was known to only a handful of people at any given time, passed within a single family of engineers, and when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the formula died with the empire. Modern chemists have proposed dozens of candidates for the active ingredient: quicklime, naphtha, pine resin, calcium phosphide, potassium nitrate. None of the reconstructions produce a substance that behaves exactly the way the historical accounts describe. Burning on water, intensifying when submerged, projectable through a pressurized siphon system at a range of several ship lengths. The weapon was real. Number 3. Damascus, steel and the blade, that cut silk in midair. Crusader knights who encountered Damascus steel blades in the 12th century wrote letters home that sound, read today, almost like they were describing something supernatural. A blade that could slice through a silk scarf dropped from above. A blade that held an edge through combat that would have chipped or dulled any European sword within minutes. A blade with a surface pattern of flowing lines and waves that appeared to be part of the metal itself, not a decoration applied to the outside. The steel came from ingots called woots, produced in southern India and Sri Lanka from around 300 AD onward, and the smiths of Damascus had developed a technique for forging these ingots into weapons that modern metallurgists spent decades attempting to replicate. In 2006, a team at the Technical University of Dresden published a paper announcing they had found carbon nanotubes inside a genuine Damascus blade. Carbon nanotubes. Structures that the materials science community in the 20th century believed they had discovered for the first time. The Damascene smiths had produced them without knowing what they were, through a process of repeated folding and heat cycling in a charcoal environment that has never been fully reconstructed. Number 4. The Antikythera mechanism and the computer that should not exist. In the year 1900, a group of sponge divers working near the island of Antikythera, off the southern coast of Greece, surfaced with fragments of what appeared to be a corroded bronze lump. The lump sat in the Athens National Archaeological Museum for the next 50 years, before researchers began to realize what they were actually looking at. It was a geared mechanical device. It contained at least 30 bronze gears of varying sizes, arranged in a system of differential mechanisms that predicted the movements of the sun and moon, calculated the metonic cycle of 235 lunar months, tracked the Saros cycle used to predict eclipses, and marked the 4-year schedule of the Panhellenic Games. It was, in functional terms, an analog computer. It was built sometime between 150 and 70 BC. The level of precision in its gear cutting, the degree of miniaturization in its components, and the sophistication of its astronomical programming would not appear again in European technology until the astronomical clocks of the 14th century. More than 14 centuries of regression. Researchers using modern X-ray tomography and imaging technology have continued to find new layers of complexity in the surviving fragments. Number 5. The Aeolipili and the steam engine that Rome buried. In the 1st century AD, a Greek mathematician named Hero of Alexandria described and almost certainly built a device he called the Aeolipile. It was a sealed metal sphere filled with water, mounted on a pivot above a heat source, with 2 bent outlet nozzles positioned on opposite sides. When the water boiled, steam escaped through the nozzles and the sphere rotated. It was a reaction turbine. It demonstrated, in functional working form, the principle that would become the basis of the steam engine 18 centuries later. Hero lived and worked in Alexandria. He produced designs for automated doors powered by steam and counterweights. He built programmable theatrical devices powered by falling sand. He described a wind-powered organ, which was the first known machine to use wind energy to drive a mechanical process. And then, the tradition of engineering that he represented ended. Not gradually. The library at Alexandria was damaged and eventually destroyed across a series of events between 48 BC and 642 AD. The engineering knowledge that Hero and his predecessors had accumulated across centuries vanished from the record. When James Watt patented his improved steam engine in 1769, he was not inventing a new principle. Number 6. The hypocaust and the heating system that disappeared for 1,000 years. At any given Roman villa during the 1st and 2nd century AD, if you had lifted a floor tile in the main living quarters, you would have found a system of small pillars holding the floor approximately 60 centimeters above the ground. Below the floor, a furnace at one end of the building pushed hot air through this void space and up through hollow tiles built into the walls. The Romans called this the hypocaust. It was underfloor central heating. It worked. Archaeological sites across Britain, Germany, France, and North Africa have revealed hypocaust systems in private homes, public baths, and administrative buildings across the entire span of the Roman Empire. When the empire collapsed in the West in the 5th century, the hypocaust went with it. For the next 1,000 years, Europeans heated their buildings with open fires in the center of rooms, filling those rooms with smoke, losing most of the heat through uninsulated walls and openings. The engineering knowledge that had produced a cleaner, more efficient, more comfortable heating system simply ceased to be practiced. The technology of underfloor heating did not reappear in European domestic construction until the 19th century. 1,400 years. Number 7. The Baghdad Battery and electricity before the wire. In 1938, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig was working in a museum in Baghdad when he found a ceramic jar sitting in a collection with very little documentation attached to it. The jar dated to around 250 AD. Inside, it was a copper cylinder. Inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod. The rod was insulated from the copper by an asphalt stopper at the top. When Koenig recognized what the assembly described, the academic world pushed back almost immediately. Because what the assembly described was a galvanic cell, a battery, a device that would produce a small electrical current when filled with an acidic liquid such as vinegar or citrus juice. Koenig hypothesized that the jars, of which approximately 12 examples survive across various collections, were used for electroplating metal objects with gold or silver. American electrical engineer Willard Gray built a functional replica in 1940, filled it with grape juice, and produced 0.5 volt of electricity. The objection that always follows is that the Romans and Parthians had no understanding of electricity and therefore could not have intentionally built an electrical device. But that objection assumes the only way to build a working technology is to fully understand the physics behind it. Number 8. The Nimrud lens and the telescope. Nobody was supposed to have. In 1850, British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard was excavating the ruins of the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud in what is now northern Iraq, when he found a small piece of polished rock crystal. The crystal was oval in shape, approximately 4 centimeters by 3 centimeters, ground flat on one side and convex on the other, with a focal length of about 11 centimeters and a magnification factor of approximately 3 times. Layard catalogued it, and it made its way to the British Museum. In 1999, Italian scholar Giovanni Pettinato proposed that the lens had been used by ancient Assyrian astronomers to observe the planet Saturn. This would explain why Assyrian astronomical records contain descriptions of Saturn, accompanied by a smaller elliptical object that no one had previously been able to account for. That smaller elliptical object matches the appearance of Saturn's rings when viewed through a 3-power magnifying lens. Astronomer Giovanni Cassini discovered the rings of Saturn in 1659 using a telescope. If Pettinato's hypothesis is correct, Assyrian astronomers were observing those rings nearly 3,000 years earlier. The official date for the invention of the telescope is 1608 or number 9, the seismoscope of Zhang Heng and what China knew in 132 AD. In the year 132 AD, a Chinese scientist and court astronomer named Zhang Heng presented Emperor Shun of the Han Dynasty with a device he called the Hufeng Didong Yi. It was a large bronze vessel shaped like an urn, roughly 6 feet in diameter, with 8 dragons positioned around the outside, each one facing a different compass direction. Below each dragon sat a bronze toad with its mouth open. Inside the vessel, an internal pendulum mechanism responded to ground movement. When an earthquake occurred, the pendulum would swing in the direction of the tremor, releasing a ball from the mouth of the dragon, facing that direction, which fell into the waiting mouth of the toad below, producing a clear, audible signal. On one occasion, the device registered a seismic event, and courtiers in the capital were skeptical because no one in the city had felt any shaking. Several days later, a messenger arrived from the province of Longqi, 400 miles to the northwest, reporting a major earthquake. The device had registered a distant tremor that no human at the capital had perceived. Zhang Heng's seismoscope preceded the next recorded seismoscopic instrument in Western science by more than 15 centuries. Number 10. The automata of Al-Jazari and the robot that served drinks in 1206. In the year 1206, a Kurdish engineer working in the Artukid court in what is now southeastern Turkey completed a manuscript he called The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. His name was Ismail al-Jazari, and the manuscript contained designs for 50 different mechanical devices, ranging from water clocks to hand-washing automata to musical machines programmed to play different melodies. Among the designs was a programmable boat intended for use at royal parties, carrying 4 mechanical musicians on an artificial lake. The musicians were automatons, mechanical figures that could be set to play specific sequences of musical notes using a rotating cylindrical drum with pegs, similar in principle to a music box, but applied to the movement of mechanical limbs striking instruments. Al-Jazari also designed a hand-washing automaton in the form of a servant figure who refilled a basin from an internal reservoir and offered a comb and towel at the appropriate point in the sequence. The mechanisms he described used sophisticated arrangements of cams, cranks, gear trains, and hydraulic circuits. Historians of engineering credit him as the father of robotics and cybernetics. Number 11. Roman surgical instruments and the medicine that medieval Europe forgot. When archaeologists excavated a house in the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, they found a room containing a collection of surgical instruments that stopped them. There were forceps, there were retractors, there were catheters, there were surgical saws for cutting bone, there were vaginal speculums with a screw mechanism for controlled dilation, there were needles, scalpels, chisels, probes, and a 4-pronged dilator for expanding wounds during surgery. The instruments were bronze and iron, manufactured to tolerances that indicated specialized production, not generalist blacksmithing. Roman military medicine operated field hospitals along every major campaign front, with trained medical staff who performed procedures, including amputation, wound closure, trepanation, and removal of arrowheads, using instruments designed for those as specific purposes. By the early medieval period, this accumulated surgical knowledge had contracted almost to nothing. The dominant medical philosophy of the 6th through 12th centuries held that physical illness was primarily a spiritual matter and that surgical intervention was at best a last resort and at worst an offense against the divine order of suffering. Number 12. The Lycurgus Cup and nanotechnology in 4th century Rome. The Lycurgus Cup sits in the British Museum, and it has been doing something that visitors often do not realize at first glance. When you shine light on it from the front, it looks green. When you put a light source inside it and look through the glass from the outside, it turns red. Not orange, not pink. A deep dichroic red, the kind of color shift that a modern optical engineer would associate with controlled nanoparticle dispersion. The cup was made in Rome in the 4th century AD, and it remained an anomaly for decades after it entered the museum's collection in 1958. In 1990, researchers using electron microscopy finally found the explanation. The glass contains nanoparticles of gold and silver alloyed together between 50 and 100 nanometers in diameter, distributed with extraordinary uniformity through the glass matrix. The ratio of gold to silver determines the specific color response. The size and distribution of the particles determines the dichroic behavior. This is nanotechnology, the controlled manufacture of metallic particles at the nanometer scale for the purpose of producing a predictable optical effect. Number 13. The piezoelectric earth and the power grid in the stone. There is a class of materials that produces an electrical charge when placed under mechanical stress. Squeeze them, compress them, and they generate voltage. This property is called piezoelectricity, and it was formally described by Pierre and Jacques Curie in 1880. Quartz is one of the most common piezoelectric materials on Earth. Granite contains quartz. Most of the megalithic structures built before 3000 BC, the standing stones of Britain and Ireland, the stone circles of France, the dolmens of northern Europe, were constructed from granite and quartz-rich sandstone. Researchers examining the stone circles at Avebury and Carnac have found that the stones were selected with unusual care for their quartz content. When equivalent stones of lower mineral density were available much closer to the construction sites, the builders transported higher quartz stones from greater distances. Number 14. The iron pillar of Delhi that should have rusted 800 years ago. In the courtyard of the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque in Delhi stands an iron pillar approximately 7 meters tall, weighing more than 6 metric tons, inscribed with a Sanskrit text dating it to the reign of Chandragupta Totu, who ruled from approximately 375 to 415 AD. The pillar has been standing in the open air in the monsoon climate of northern India for more than 1600 years. It has not rusted. Iron exposed to that climate for that length of time should be a crumbling mass of iron oxide. The pillar is not. An analysis published in the journal Current Science in 2002 identified the reason. The surface of the iron contains a thin layer of a compound called misoete, a form of iron hydrogen phosphate, hydrate, that formed through an ancient surface treatment involving the application of a slag mixture during the forging process, combined with specific heat treatments. This surface layer is self-repairing. Researchers at the Indian Institute of Technology, who studied the pillar, concluded that the metallurgical process used to forge it was not simply very good ancient ironwork. It was a controlled corrosion resistance technique that achieved results modern metallurgists cannot yet fully replicate. Number 15. The Dendera reliefs and light in the temple. On the inner walls of the crypt beneath the temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt, carved in detail fine enough to require either excellent natural light or an artificial light source, are a series of bas-reliefs that an Austrian electrical engineer named Walter Gahn first analyzed in 1891 and concluded were depicting electrical discharge tubes. The reliefs show large elongated objects that taper from a base fitting into what appears to be a pillar-shaped support structure. Inside the elongated objects, carved lines suggest a filament. A snake-like form within the tube extends from one end toward the other, which some researchers have identified as a representation of the ionized gas column, visible inside a working high-voltage discharge tube. The standard Egyptological interpretation is that the reliefs depict lotus flowers with serpents emerging from them, in keeping with standard Egyptian religious iconography. Number 16. The Saqqara bird and what Egypt understood about flight. In 1898, a wooden artifact was found in a tomb at Saqqara, Egypt, dating to approximately 200 BC. The artifact was catalogued as a bird-shaped toy, tagged with a small label, and placed in a storage tray in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it sat essentially unexamined for 70 years. In 1969, an Egyptologist named Khalil Messiha was reviewing stored artifacts and noticed that the Saqqara bird had a feature that no actual bird possesses. Its tail fin was vertical. Wings on birds are horizontal, but a vertical tail stabilizer is a feature of aircraft design, specifically because a vertical fin provides yaw stability, correcting the tendency of a fixed-wing body to rotate sideways during flight. A horizontal tail surface corrects pitch. An aircraft has both. A bird has only horizontal tail control surfaces. The Saqqara object has a vertical tail fin and no horizontal tail surface whatsoever. Aviation historian Martin Gregoire built a scale model of the Saqqara bird in 1985 and found that the proportions, when combined with a horizontal tail surface, produced a glider with reasonable aerodynamic stability. Messiha organized a conference in 1971 that included several aviation engineers. Number 17. Derinkuyu and the underground city, built for 30,000 people. Beneath the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, carved directly into the volcanic tuff, is a city that descends 18 levels below the surface of the ground. The city of Derinkuyu was capable of housing, feeding, and sheltering an estimated 30 to 50,000 people indefinitely, along with their livestock and food stores. It has ventilation shafts, some of them more than 50 meters deep, that maintained breathable air throughout the complex. It has wells. It has separate areas for wine and oil production. It has churches, schools, and rooms that appear to have functioned as meeting halls. The stone doors that blocked passage between levels are circular, weighing between 200 and 500 kilograms each, and could be rolled into position and locked from the inside within seconds. The city was rediscovered in 1963, when a resident of the modern village above it broke through a wall in his home and found a tunnel leading downward. Archaeologists have since mapped approximately 1/3 of the complex. The full extent remains unmapped. The dating of Derinkuyu's construction is uncertain. Number 18. The Phaistos disc and the movable type. Nobody was supposed to invent yet. In 1908, Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier found a fired clay disc at the Minoan palace site of Phaistos on the island of Crete. The disc is approximately 16 centimeters in diameter and impressed on both sides with a spiral sequence of 45 distinct symbols, arranged into groups separated by a line, reading from the outside edge toward the center. The disc has been undeciphered for more than 100 years and remains one of the most studied unsolved inscriptions in archaeology. But the method of its production is not disputed. The symbols on the Phaistos disc were not carved or written by hand. Each symbol was impressed into the wet clay using a separate stamp, a preformed tool pressed into the surface. The symbols are too consistent, too identical across each instance for hand carving. The Phaistos disc was produced using a system of movable type stamps. Individual preformed characters, each on its own stamp, pressed into the medium sequentially to compose text. This is the principle of movable type printing. Johannes Gutenberg is credited with inventing movable type printing in approximately 1440 AD. The Phaistos disc was produced by a Minoan civilization in approximately 1700 BC, number 19. Pre-Columbian gold electroplating in South America. In 1937, researchers studying gold artifacts from pre-Columbian cultures in Ecuador and Peru began noticing something that the standard metallurgical history of the Americas could not explain. The surfaces of certain artifacts were not solid gold. They were base metal objects with an extremely thin, extremely even layer of gold deposited on the surface, bonded to the base material in a way that simple gilding or hammering gold leaf over a base could not account for. A study published in the journal Science in 1986 confirmed the mechanism. The pre-Columbian craftsmen of the Andean region had developed an electrochemical process using plant acids and mineral salts that produced a controlled electrochemical deposition of gold ions onto a base metal substrate. The process is functionally equivalent to electroplating. It is not exactly the same procedure as modern electroplating, which uses an external electrical current, but the outcome, a controlled, uniform, microscopically thin and adherent gold surface deposited through electrochemical action, is the same result achieved by a different path. The technology of electroplating gold onto base metal surfaces is officially attributed to Luigi Brugnatelli of Italy, who used a voltaic pile to achieve it in 1805. Number 20. Maya astronomical precision and the calendar that beat modern computers. The Maya long count calendar was a system of interlocking astronomical cycles that tracked the movements of Venus, the lunar cycle, solar years, and what the Maya called the Great Cycle, a period of approximately 5,125 years. The precision of the Maya calculation of the Venus cycle was 584 days. The modern computed average of the Venus synodic period is 583.92 days. The Maya were off by less than 1 day across their entire Venus tracking system. They achieved this through naked eye observation, systematic record-keeping spanning generations of astronomers, and a mathematical system that included the concept of zero, a conceptual tool that European mathematics would not formally adopt until the 12th century, via Arab transmission of Indian mathematical principles. The Maya also computed a lunar month of 29.5 with 302 days. The modern scientific figure is 29.5359 days. This is not approximate. This is precise to the 4th decimal place. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Maya books, contains eclipse prediction tables that modern astronomers have verified as accurate across a span of centuries. Number 21. Vitrified Scottish forts and the temperature nobody can account for. Scattered across the Highlands of Scotland are the ruins of approximately 70 hilltop forts, whose stone walls display a phenomenon that archaeologists documented in the 18th century and have never satisfactorily explained. The stones are fused, not mortared, not laid. Fused together by heat so intense that the granite and sandstone blocks flowed into each other at the contact surfaces, creating a single glassy mass from what were once individual stones. The process is called vitrification. To vitrify granite requires sustained temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius applied evenly across the surface of the stonework. A wood fire burning against the wall of a stone fort might produce localized temperatures approaching that figure, but could not maintain them uniformly enough to produce the even fusing visible in the vitrified Scottish forts. These walls show uniform fusion along extended runs of stonework. The standard explanation is that the forts were deliberately fired by attackers, or perhaps by the inhabitants themselves in a deliberate decommissioning ritual. But this explanation requires a fire that achieved and maintained temperatures sufficient to vitrify stone across large sections of wall, which a wood fire cannot do. Number 22. The star forts of the Old World and the architecture nobody can explain. If you search for any major city in Europe or the Americas from above, using satellite imagery, in the period before approximately 1820, you will find something that becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence once you have seen it enough times. The fortifications. The perfectly geometric, multi-pointed, star-shaped defensive enclosures that surround city after city across every continent where European civilization was established. Venice, Palmanova, Naarden, Coevorden, Bourtange, Kronborg, Nicosia, Famagusta, Valletta, St. Augustine in Florida, Louisbourg in Nova Scotia, Cartagena in Colombia, the Citadel in Haiti. These structures share an architectural language so consistent, so precisely engineered, so advanced in its application of geometry and ballistic deflection theory, that military historians describe them as the product of a single tradition that spread across the world. The standard explanation is that the trace Italian design, developed in Italy in the early 16th century, diffused across Europe and then the colonial world through military engineers trained in the same tradition. Number 23. Piri Reis and the map that showed Antarctica, 2 centuries before discovery. In 1929, a group of historians working in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul found a map drawn on gazelle skin, dated to 1513, signed by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis. The map showed the Atlantic Ocean, the coastlines of Europe and Africa, and a large landmass at the southern edge that Piri Reis labelled as the Lower Country. This southern landmass was later compared to the coastline of Antarctica by map historian Charles Hapgood, who published an analysis in 1966, arguing that the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map corresponded to the subglacial topography of Antarctica, the actual shape of the continent beneath its ice sheet, with an accuracy that would not be matched by modern technology until the seismic surveys of the International Geophysical Year in 1958. Antarctica was officially discovered by European explorers in 1820. The ice sheet that covers it has been there for at least 15 million years. The subglacial coastline that the Piri Reis map appears to depict has been buried under ice for millions of years. Piri Reis wrote on the map that he compiled it from older source maps, some of them, he noted, dating to the time of Alexander the Great or before. Number 24. Roman roads and the engineering that outlasted the engineers. The Romans built approximately 85,000 kilometers of paved road across their empire, and sections of those roads are still in use today. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BC, still carries traffic. The engineering methodology the Romans applied was not simple. A proper Roman road was not a layer of gravel on flattened ground. It was a stratified structure, beginning with a deep trench, lined at the bottom with large flat stones set in sand, followed by a layer of broken stone and rubble bound with mortar, followed by a layer of smaller gravel, compacted into the mortar layer, and topped with large flat paving stones set in a slight convex curve to shed rainwater to drainage channels on either side. The total depth of this structure was often 60 centimeters or more. The Romans surveyed their roads using an instrument called a groma, which allowed them to lay out straight alignments across hundreds of kilometers with deviations of less than 1 degree. Many Roman roads in Britain that have been buried under medieval and modern construction are straighter than the replacement roads built on top of them. When the Roman administration withdrew from Britain in 410 AD, the road-building tradition went with it. Number 25. Al-Kindi and the cryptanalysis that waited 8 centuries. In the 9th century AD, the Arab polymath Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, working in Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate, wrote a manuscript called the Manuscript on Deciphering Cryptographic Messages. In it, he described the method of frequency analysis for breaking substitution ciphers. Frequency analysis works because in any language, certain letters appear more often than others. In Arabic, certain characters appear with a statistical regularity that can be measured. In any sufficiently long ciphertext produced by a simple substitution cipher, the frequency distribution of the cipher symbols will mirror the frequency distribution of the plaintext language. By mapping the most common cipher symbols to the most common letters of the target language, a trained analyst can recover the plaintext without knowing the key. Al-Kindi described this method with complete clarity and precision approximately 800 years before European cryptanalysts reinvented it. His manuscript was not discovered in European archives until 1987. Number 26. Chinese south-pointing chariot and the differential gear of 200 AD. The south-pointing chariot was a two-wheeled vehicle built for Chinese emperors beginning in the reign of the Yellow Emperor, with a documented reconstruction made for the Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang dynasty around 720 AD. On top of the chariot stood a figure of a person with one arm extended, pointing. Regardless of which direction the chariot turned, regardless of how many times it reversed direction or navigated curves, the figure always pointed south. It did not use a magnetic compass. It used a differential gear train connected to the wheels. As the chariot turned, the left and right wheels moved at different speeds. The differential gear mechanism translated this difference in wheel speed into a counter-rotation of the figure that exactly compensated for the change in direction of travel. The mechanical principle underlying this device is the same principle used in the differential gear of every automobile and truck produced in the 20th century. The differential gear was critical to the development of mechanized transport because it allows a driven vehicle to navigate corners without the inner and outer wheels fighting each other. The earliest European patents for differential gear mechanisms date to the 18th century. Number 27. Roman glassblowing at industrial scale and the clear glass nobody could copy. When Venetian glassmakers of the 15th century finally developed a process for producing clear, colorless glass that they called cristallo, it was considered a technological revolution. The ability to produce glass that was genuinely transparent, not tinted green or brown or amber by iron and other mineral contaminants, required a decolorizing agent, specifically manganese dioxide, added to the melt in precisely calibrated quantities. This was celebrated in 15th century Venice as a new invention. Roman glassmakers had been producing clear glass using manganese dioxide decolorization since at least the 1st century AD. The technique was documented, practiced at scale across glassmaking workshops from Alexandria to Cologne, and produced window glass, vessel glass, and decorative glass of a clarity that Venetian craftsmen would spend centuries trying to match. Between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the emergence of Venetian cristallo, European glass production was generally restricted to the greenish and brownish varieties produced without decolorization. The knowledge that manganese dioxide eliminated the color contamination from glass was lost from European practice for approximately 1,000 years. Number 28. The Karnak stones and the alignment that should require surveying technology. In the Brittany region of northwestern France, approximately 3,000 standing stones are arranged in parallel rows running across the landscape for a distance of more than 4 kilometers. The rows are not random. They are aligned to within fractions of a degree of astronomical reference points. British engineer and archaeoastronomer Alexander Thom, who spent decades surveying megalithic sites across Britain and France beginning in the 1930s, found that the Karnak alignments incorporated a standard unit of measurement he called the megalithic yard, equivalent to approximately 2.72 feet, used consistently across megalithic construction sites from Scotland to Brittany. The consistency of this unit across thousands of kilometers and thousands of years of construction suggest either an astonishing cultural uniformity or a shared tradition of measurement passed through a connected network of builders. The astronomical alignments at Karnak point towards the rising and setting positions of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, and toward the rising and setting positions of the moon at the extremes of its 18.6-year cycle. Number 29. The Great Pyramid's internal air shafts and the engineering precision inside. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains, inside the body of its masonry, 4 narrow shafts that run from 2 of the interior chambers upward through the body of the pyramid at precise angles. In the Queen's Chamber, the 2 shafts do not reach the exterior face of the pyramid. They terminate inside the masonry. In the King's Chamber, 2 shafts run completely through the pyramid and exit at the outer surface. In 1964, astronomer Virginia Trimble and Egyptologist Alexander Badawi computed the directions that the King's Chamber shafts pointed when the pyramid was built, approximately 2560 BC. The southern shaft pointed, at that time, directly toward the star Orion's belt in its lower culmination. The northern shaft pointed toward the star Thuban, which was the pole star in 2560 BC. In 1993, a robot camera called Upu-Aut-2, sent up the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber, found that the shaft was blocked by a small stone door approximately 65 meters into the shaft. In 2002, a drill camera penetrated that door and found a second door behind it. In 2011, the Jedi robot discovered what appear to be hieroglyphic symbols painted on the floor of the space behind the first door. The full purpose of the shafts remains unresolved. Number 30. The Pantheon and the concrete dome that should have collapsed. The dome of the Pantheon in Rome was completed approximately 125 AD during the reign of Emperor Hadrian. It is 43.3 meters in diameter. For 300 years, until the construction of the Florence Cathedral Dome in 1436, it was the largest dome in the world. It is still standing. It has not been significantly repaired or restored. The engineering approach that makes it possible is not simple good luck. The Romans used progressively lighter concrete mixtures as the dome rises from its base to its apex. Near the base, the concrete contains heavy aggregate, dense volcanic stone and rubble. As the structure rises, the aggregate transitions to lighter materials, tufa and pumice, until at the top, near the oculus, the concrete is made with the lightest volcanic material available. The oculus itself, the circular opening at the crown of the dome, is 8.2 meters in diameter and is the only source of natural light in the building. When it rains, the rain falls through the oculus. The floor is slightly convex and drained by a hidden system of holes. The structural load path of the dome is managed through a series of stepped rings visible on the exterior that distribute the compressive forces into the walls below. Number 31. Pumapunku and the stone that was machined. At the site of Pumapunku in Bolivia, at an altitude of nearly 3,900 meters above sea level, are the remains of a structure built from andesite and red sandstone blocks that have been cut with a precision that archaeological orthodoxy struggles to account for. The andesite blocks at Pumapunku are among the hardest stones found in the region. Cutting them required tools harder than the stone itself. The surfaces of certain blocks at Pumapunku are flat to within a fraction of a millimeter across their entire face. The angles cut into the blocks are consistently 90 degrees to tolerances that modern machining would measure in thousandths of an inch. The interlocking H-shaped blocks that repeat across the site are identical to each other, suggesting either a template and jig production system or a level of craftsman skill consistent enough to produce matching results by hand across dozens of individual pieces. The site was apparently destroyed in ancient times, possibly by seismic activity, which means the blocks that survive are fragments of a structure that was significantly more complex in its original assembled form. The culture credited with building Pumapunku, the Tiwanaku civilization, flourished between approximately 500 and 1000 AD. Number 32. Skara Brae and the Neolithic plumbing that predates Rome. On the mainland of Orkney, off the northern tip of Scotland, buried under sand dunes until a storm exposed them in 1850, are the remains of a Neolithic village dating to approximately 3100 BC. Skara Brae is older than Stonehenge. It is older than the Great Pyramid, and each of its 8 surviving stone houses contains something that archaeologists initially found difficult to categorize. Built into the walls of the structures are stone drainage channels leading from the interior to the exterior of each house. Each house also contains a stone cell in the corner that is separated from the living area by a short stone partition, positioned directly over a drainage channel that leads outward through the wall. The interpretation that most researchers now accept is that Skara Brae's inhabitants had indoor toilet facilities, with drainage built into their stone houses 5,000 years ago. The Romans are credited with bringing indoor plumbings and sewage drainage to Britain when they arrived in 43 AD. Skara Brae had a working drainage and waste disposal system, built from stone without mortar 5,000 years before the Romans. The builders of Skara Brae also had furniture. Number 33. The Voynich manuscript and the language nobody has broken. In 1912, a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich purchased a manuscript in a collection of old books from the Jesuit library at Villa Mondragone near Rome. The manuscript was carbon dated in 2009 to between 1404 and 1438 AD. It is approximately 240 pages long, written in an unknown script, illustrated with drawings of plants that do not match any identified species, astronomical diagrams, human figures bathing in green fluid connected by elaborate pipe systems, and pages of dense text arranged in paragraphs with consistent formatting. The script has never been deciphered. It has defeated professional cryptanalysts, amateur code breakers, linguists, computer programs, and a team of University of Manchester researchers who applied information theory analysis to it in 2019 and concluded that the manuscript contained a genuine underlying language with statistical properties consistent with natural language structure, not a hoax or random symbol generation. The plants depicted are not from any known botanical record. The astronomical diagrams contain circular arrangements of stars that do not map to any known star catalogue. Number 34. Aztec Chinampa Engineering and the Floating Garden Network. When Spanish conquistadors first arrived at the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, they found a city built on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the mainland by causeways and surrounded by a system of floating rectangular garden plots extending across the lake surface as far as they could see. These were the Chinampas, and they were the agricultural engine of a civilization that fed a metropolitan population of between 200,000 and 400,000 people, which would have made Tenochtitlan one of the 5 largest cities in the world at that time. The Chinampas were not simply rafts with soil piled on them. They were engineered agricultural beds, constructed by staking out a rectangular area with poles driven into the lake bed, weaving branches between the poles to create a frame, layering aquatic vegetation, lake mud, and organic material within the frame until the bed reached slightly above the water surface, and planting willows along the edges whose root systems eventually bound the Chinampa to the lake floor and stabilized it permanently. The shallow canals between the Chinampas allowed canoe access to every bed, provided drainage, and enabled the constant cycling of nutrient-rich lake mud from the canal bottoms onto the garden surfaces. Number 35. The London Hammer and the Iron in the Stone. In 1936, near the town of London in Texas, a couple named Max and Emma Hahn found a piece of rock with a wooden handle protruding from it near a waterfall. The rock was broken open, and inside was a hammer. The handle was partly coalified, converted partly to coal by the surrounding mineral environment. The head of the hammer was iron. Analysis of the hammerhead found it to consist of approximately 96% iron, 2.5% chlorine, and less than 1% sulfur. Modern iron smelting does not produce iron of this purity without significant effort. The chlorine content is unusual, as modern iron production works to exclude chlorine. The surface of the hammerhead had partially converted to iron oxide, but the interior had not rusted, which has been interpreted as a result of the unusual composition of the iron. The geological formation that encased the hammer was dated by some researchers to the Cretaceous period, which would make the hammer hundreds of millions of years old, a claim that creationist researchers have used to argue for a young Earth. Number 36. The Persian Qanat and the underground river system, built without machines. The Qanat is an engineering technology developed in ancient Persia, modern Iran, that solved the fundamental problem of delivering water across a dry landscape from a high elevation source, aquifer, to a low elevation destination without pumps, without energy inputs of any kind, and without maintenance of the water source itself once construction was complete. The system works as follows. A well is sunk at the base of a mountain or elevated terrain until it reaches the water table. A gently sloping tunnel is then excavated from the destination back toward the source, rising slightly over its length until it intersects the water table at the source location. The slope is calculated with extreme precision, because a tunnel that slopes too steeply will erode, and a tunnel that slopes too shallowly will not carry water at a useful rate. A series of vertical shafts are sunk along the line of the tunnel to allow excavated material to be removed and to provide access for maintenance workers. The water flows from the elevated source through the horizontal tunnel by gravity alone, emerging at the surface at the destination end as a continuously flowing stream, regardless of weather, regardless of season, without a pump or any moving part. Number 37. Nan Madol and the basalt city built on open ocean. On the eastern coast of the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia, extending over approximately 18 square kilometers of tidal flat and open reef, are the ruins of a city built from prismatic basalt logs, interlocked in a log cabin style, forming walls, platforms, canals, and artificial islands that together constitute the only ancient city ever built on a reef. The site is called Nan Madol, and it served as the ceremonial and political center of the Sodlur dynasty from approximately 1100 to 1628 AD. The basalt columns used to build it were quarried from sources on the opposite side of the island, in some accounts from a basalt flow more than 30 kilometers away. The largest individual stones at the site weigh an estimated 50 tons. The total amount of basalt moved to the site is estimated at 750,000 metric tons. The builders transported basalt columns weighing tons across open water on rafts or canoes to a tidal platform site, without any harbor facilities, using no metal tools and no wheeled transport. The traditional account of how this was done, preserved in oral history on Pohnpei, involves the use of magic, specifically a flying magic that levitated the stones from the quarry to the site. Number 38. The Inca stone, joining that has no mortar and no gap. Throughout the surviving architecture of the Inca Empire, from Sacsayhuaman above Cusco to Machu Picchu, to the streets of the old city center of Cusco itself, there is a quality of stone construction that has attracted structural engineers, architects, and archaeologists for centuries and resisted easy explanation. Stones of very large size, sometimes weighing hundreds of tons, are fitted together without mortar, without binding agent of any kind, with contact surfaces that fit together so closely that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. This would be remarkable if the stones were regular geometric blocks. It is extraordinary because many of the stones are not regular at all. They are polygonal, with multiple faces, each meeting the corresponding face of a different adjacent stone at precise matching angles. The stone at Sacsayhuaman, known as the Stone of 12 Angles, has, as its name implies, 12 distinct angles in its perimeter, each one matching a corresponding angle in one of its 12 neighbors. The standard explanation offered for how this was achieved is that the Inca used a combination of abrasion, trial fitting, and progressive adjustment, moving each stone repeatedly to grind the contact surfaces to a match. Number 39. Göbekli Tepe and the organization that should not have existed. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd in southeastern Turkey noticed an unusual stone protruding from the ground on a hilltop at a site called Göbekli Tepe, which translates as Potbelly Hill. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating the site in 1996 and continued until his death in 2014. What he found has not been fully incorporated into the standard model of human prehistory because it does not fit. Göbekli Tepe is a complex of circular stone enclosures, each ringed by T-shaped limestone pillars, up to 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, carved with reliefs of animals including foxes, snakes, boars, cranes, ducks, scorpions, and vultures. The site was built in multiple phases. The earliest phases, the deepest and oldest layers, are the most sophisticated. The larger, more elaborate enclosures are the older ones. As the site continued to be built over centuries, the constructions became smaller and simpler, not more advanced. This inversion of the expected pattern of progressive technological development has not been satisfactorily explained. More fundamentally, the site dates to approximately 9600 BC, making it more than 11,000 years old. Number 40. Ancient copper mining at Lake Superior and the 5,000-year gap. On the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale in the Great Lakes region of North America, archaeologists have documented thousands of copper mining pits dating to between 3000 and 1000 BC. The quantity of copper removed from these sites has been estimated by various researchers at between 1.5 and 500,000 metric tons, though the precise figure is disputed. What is not disputed is that the mining occurred at an industrial scale for a period of approximately 2,000 years and then stopped. When European explorers arrived in the region in the 17th century, the indigenous inhabitants of the Great Lakes area worked copper but did not mine it at the scale evident in the ancient pits. The copper artifacts of the eastern woodland cultures, mined from exposed surface deposits, are entirely different in character from what the industrial-scale pit mines of the earlier period could have produced. Where did 2,000 years of industrially extracted Lake Superior copper go? It does not appear in the archaeological record of North America in quantities that match the extraction, number 41. The Nazca lines and the geometry that requires altitude. On the pampa of the Nazca Desert in southern Peru, covering an area of approximately 450 square kilometers, are several hundred geoglyphs created by removing the reddish iron, oxide-coated stones from the desert surface to reveal the lighter ground beneath. The figures include spiders, hummingbirds, monkeys, fish, sharks, orcas, lemurs, and lizards, some of them with wingspans or body lengths exceeding 200 meters. There are also hundreds of straight lines, some of them running for more than 8 kilometers without deviation, and geometric shapes including spirals, trapezoids, and rectangles covering areas of many hectares. The lines are perfectly straight by any measurement applied to them and maintain their geometric integrity over their full length, despite the irregular terrain beneath them. The figures are recognizable as coherent images only from a significant altitude above the surface. At ground level, they look like nothing but cleared paths. The standard explanation for how the Nazca people created the figures is that they used a grid system with stakes and rope. scaling up images from small drawings using consistent proportional enlargement. Number 42. Minoan indoor plumbing and the flush toilet of 1700 BC. The Minoan palace at Knossos on the island of Crete was excavated beginning in 1900 by British archaeologist Arthur Evans and revealed a complex of approximately 1,300 rooms, covering an area of about 150,000 square meters, dating to approximately 1700 to 1400 BC. Among the features of the palace that Evans and subsequent archaeologists documented was a complete system of indoor plumbing. Clay pipes, joined with gasket-style overlapping connections and tapering slightly toward the outlet end to maintain water pressure, ran through the walls of the palace to deliver water to bathrooms, washrooms, and lavatory facilities. The Queen's bathroom at Knossos contains a terracotta bathtub and drainage facilities connected to the palace sewer system. There is evidence for a water closet in the eastern wing, with a wooden seat and a drainage system below. The drainage system collected wastewater and waste from the palace facilities and directed it through increasingly large clay conduits to sewers that drained away from the building. This system was functional in approximately 1700 BC. It was forgotten, along with the Minoan civilization, when that civilization collapsed in approximately 1450 BC, most likely due to the volcanic eruption at the nearby island of Thera. Number 43. The Mohenjo-Daro sewage system and the urban planning nobody expected. When British archaeologists began excavating the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley in the 1920s, they found a city that had been built approximately 2600 BC and abandoned approximately 1900 BC, and that had features of urban planning and civil engineering that were not supposed to exist at that date. The city was laid out on a grid. The streets ran north-south and east-west in a regular plan. The buildings were made of standardized fired brick, all of the same size ratio, indicating the existence of a standardized measurement system. And almost every house in the city was connected to a municipal sewage system. Drains ran from individual households into covered street drains, which ran into larger collector sewers, which directed waste to the edge of the city. The drains were built with access ports for cleaning. The streets had brick-lined drainage channels along their sides for runoff. The city had a large public bath, the Great Bath, with a waterproofed floor and walls made watertight with bitumen, fed by a well and drained by a large outlet. Number 44. The Tartaria tablets and the writing that should not be that old. In 1961, archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa was excavating a site called Tartaria in Romania when he found 3 small clay tablets covered in symbols associated with a ritual burial. The tablets were dated using radiocarbon methods applied to materials in the same stratigraphic layer and produced an age of approximately 5300 to 5500 BC, which would make them the oldest known writing in the world, predating the Sumerian cuneiform writing of Mesopotamia by more than 1,000 years. The academic response to this dating was divided. Some researchers accepted it. Others argued that the tablets must have been deposited in their older stratum artificially, that they were a later intrusion, because the existence of systematic symbolic writing in southeastern Europe in 5500 BC was not compatible with the accepted model of how writing was invented and where it was invented first. Number 45. Roman optical fiber and the glass that conducted light. In Roman decorative glasswork from the 1st and 2nd century AD, there exists a class of objects made using a technique called millefiori, meaning 1,000 flowers, in which rods of colored glass are bundled and fused together and then drawn out while hot into thin fibers that, when sliced, reveal a cross-section of the original bundle pattern. This technique requires an understanding that individual glass fibers can transmit patterns of color along their length and emerge intact at the other end. The mechanics of this process involve the same principle that underlies modern fiber optic cable. Light and, in the case of Millefiori, pattern information is preserved and transmitted through a glass fiber by total internal reflection within the glass. Roman glassmakers did not understand total internal reflection as a physical principle, but they understood empirically that glass could be drawn into fibers and that patterns remained coherent in those fibers across their length. Number 46. The star forts as free energy receivers. There is a researcher community, operating largely outside academic validation, that has spent the last decade examining the geometric design of the star fort, the angled bastion defensive structures found across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and proposing an explanation for their design that has nothing to do with cannon ballistics. The conventional military history explanation for the star fort is that its angled projecting bastions eliminated the dead zones found at the base of medieval round towers, allowing defenders to cover every point of the wall with overlapping fields of fire. This explanation is technically sound and no one disputes it. The alternative proposal is that the shape of the star fort, which is geometrically similar to both the shape of the human heart and certain electromagnetic field patterns, was also designed by a civilization with more sophisticated energy science than the reset, left intact, to collect and focus atmospheric energy. The researchers point to the frequency with which star forts were built near bodies of water, the common presence of wells at their centers, and the distribution of surviving star fort sites as corresponding roughly to the proposed energy grid of a global civilization. They identify with Tartaria. Number 47. Tyrian purple and the industrial dye facility of 1200 BC. Tyrian purple was the most expensive commodity in the ancient Mediterranean world, weight for weight more costly than gold during periods of peak demand, produced from the hypobranchial gland of sea snails of the genus Murex, processed through a controlled fermentation and oxidation procedure that converted the gland secretion into a stable, light-fast dye that did not fade in sunlight and did not wash out in seawater. The dye was produced in the Phoenician city of Tyre, on the coast of modern Lebanon, from approximately 1570 BC onward, and the mountains of discarded Murex shells that survive near ancient Phoenician coastal sites indicate production at an industrial scale. A single gram of dye required approximately 10,000 individual snails. The robes of Roman emperors, the vestments of Catholic bishops, the cloth draped over statues of the Virgin Mary in medieval iconography. All these purple garments derive their color symbolism from the association of Tyrian purple with absolute power and wealth. Number 48. The mechanical theatre of Hero and the programmable performance. The same hero of Alexandria, who built the Aeolipili steam turbine, also designed and built what he described as an automatic theatre, a mechanical device that performed a 10-minute dramatic presentation entirely without human operators once it was set in motion. The performance Hero described told the story of the god Dionysus and involved moving figures, fire effects produced by miniature automated braziers, and sound effects including the beating of drums and the hissing of flame. The mechanism that ran this performance used a binary arrangement of falling sand driving a series of cams and gear trains, with each cam profile controlling the timing and extent of a specific movement or effect in the presentation. The programming was encoded in the physical shape of the cams and the arrangement of the sand channels in a way that is functionally equivalent to the programming of a punch card. To change the performance, Hero described, you change the cam shapes. The device was described in Hero's treatise on automata, written in the 1st century AD. It is not known whether a working example of the automatic theatre was ever built, or whether it remained a design specification. Number 49. Wood steel and the secret buried in the carbon lattice. The steel produced in southern India from a process involving the high carbon fusion of iron and organic material in sealed clay crucibles was known to traders across the ancient world by several names. In the Arab world, it was called pulad. In the Persian world, it was called fulad. European traders called it swoots, from a transcription error of the Kannada word ukku. Whatever the name, the material it described was a high-carbon tool and weapon steel produced in small ingots that were exported from production centres in modern Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh across the trade routes of the Indian Ocean world to smiths in Persia, the Arab world, and Central Asia, who forged the ingots into weapons and tools of legendary quality. The process of producing woots involved heating iron with charcoal and organic material, plant material, and animal material in a sealed crucible to a temperature at which the iron absorbed carbon from the organic contents, producing a high-carbon steel. When cooled slowly under specific thermal conditions, the high-carbon content organized into a lattice of iron carbide particles within a low-carbon steel matrix, producing the banded pattern visible on the surface of Damascus blades, forged from Wootz ingots. Number 50. The acoustic chambers of the megalithic temples. The megalithic temples of Malta, particularly Hagar Chim and the Hypogeum of Halsaflieni, are among the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world, dating to between 3600 and 2500 BC. The Hypogeum is a multi-level underground structure carved from limestone, with chambers at several depths below the surface. In one of the main chambers, called the Oracle Room, a rectangular niche cut into the wall produces an extraordinary acoustic effect. A male voice speaking into the niche, or even humming at a specific pitch, produces a resonance throughout the chamber structure that researchers have measured at approximately 110 Hz. Acoustics researcher Igor Reznikov, who has spent decades studying the acoustic properties of prehistoric painted caves, has found that many Paleolithic cave art sites are concentrated at points where the natural cave acoustics produce strong resonance effects. Number 51. The optical telegraph and the information network, before electricity. In 1792, a French engineer named Claude Chappe built the first working optical telegraph tower in France and demonstrated that visual signals could be transmitted across large distances faster than a horse could carry a message. By 1799, the Chappe optical telegraph network connected Paris to all major French cities via a chain of relay towers, each within line of sight of the next, each operated by a semaphore arm system that could encode 196 distinct signals. Military messages that would have taken days to courier by horse could be transmitted the length of France in minutes. Napoleon used the system extensively. By 1846, France had 556 telegraph stations covering 5,000 kilometers of communication lines. Similar systems were independently developed in Britain, Sweden, Prussia, and Russia. The British Admiralty semaphore system connected London to Portsmouth in 1796. The technology worked. It was fast, reliable, and widely deployed. It was replaced by the electric telegraph within a decade of the first Morse code transmission in 1838 and largely dismantled. No thought was given to preserving the towers or the operator training tradition. But this is not the point that most interests researchers who study pre-reset communication systems. Number 52. The mud flood evidence in European basements. There is a category of photographic and architectural evidence that a community of independent researchers has been documenting and circulating since approximately 2015. That, if the interpretation these researchers apply to it is correct, constitutes physical evidence of a catastrophic global event that buried the ground floors of buildings across European cities in a layer of mud sometime in the early 19th century. The evidence takes several forms. Old photographs of European cities from the 1850s and 1860s, the earliest period for which photographic records exist, sometimes show doorways and windows that appear to be at or below street level, with the ground surface meeting the building at what would architecturally be expected to be the second floor. Basements in certain buildings, in cities from Berlin to Paris to Edinburgh to Istanbul, have features, doors, windows, tiled floors, finished ceilings that suggest they were originally ground floor rooms, not utility spaces designed to be below grade. There are buildings in several European cities where the street level has been officially raised by urban administrators during the 19th century, accounting for the partially buried appearance of older structures. Number 53. Pre-Columbian. Rubber processing and the vulcanization. Nobody invented first. When Charles Goodyear received his patent for vulcanized rubber in 1844, the chemical process he had developed, treating natural rubber latex with sulfur under heat to produce a stable, elastic, weather-resistant material, was celebrated as one of the great industrial discoveries of the century. Goodyear spent years in poverty developing the process and died heavily in debt, despite the commercial success it eventually generated. The Olmec civilization of Mesoamerica, which flourished from approximately 1500 to 400 BC, made rubber balls from the latex of the Castilla elastica tree, mixed with juice from the moonflower vine. Analysis of surviving balls and rubber artifacts from Olmec and subsequent Mesoamerican sites, published by researchers at MIT in 2010, found that the specific mixture of latex and moonflower juice that Mesoamerican rubber workers used produced a chemically modified rubber with enhanced elasticity and durability compared to untreated latex. The moonflower juice contains sulfur compounds. The process of mixing latex with sulfur-containing plant juice under the kind of heat conditions available in tropical processing is chemically similar to the sulfur vulcanization that Goodyear patented 3,000 years later. Number 54. The Thornborough Henges and the Celestial Blueprint on the ground. 3 large henge monuments are arranged in a line across the Vale of Mowbray in North Yorkshire, in a configuration that has interested archaeologists and archaeoastronomers since the 1990s. The Thornborough Henges, each approximately 240 meters in diameter, are spaced and oriented in a way that mirrors the arrangement and spacing of the 3 stars of Orion's belt as they appear in the night sky. Researcher John Grigsby and archaeologist Jan Harding have studied the site extensively. The henges date to between 3500 and 2500 BC. The surfaces of the henges were covered in gypsum, a white mineral that would have made them brilliantly visible in the landscape, particularly in moonlight, suggesting they were designed to be seen at night and possibly to mirror the sky above for an observer standing at the site. The Orion correlation at Thornborough echoes a more famous theory applied to the pyramids at Giza by Robert Bovell in the early 1990s, which proposed that the 3 main pyramids of the Giza Plateau mirror the alignment of Orion's belt as it appeared in approximately 10,500 BC. Both correlations are contested in archaeoastronomical literature. The geometry of the Thornborough alignment itself is not contested. Number 55. The Hellenistic artillery and the engineering of precision weapons. The Greek and Macedonian military engineers of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC developed a series of artillery devices, torsion-powered bolt shooters and stone throwers called ballistae and catapults that were engineered with a level of precision and standardization that modern historians of technology find remarkable. The torsion spring of a Hellenistic ballista was made from bundles of organic fiber, sinew, or hair, twisted under extreme tension within a frame. The power of the weapon was determined by the diameter and tension of the spring bundle, and Greek military engineers of the 3rd century BC developed a formula relating the weight of the projectile to the required spring bundle, diameter in a mathematical relationship that a researcher named Marsden, studying ancient siege warfare in the 1960s, found to be empirically accurate when tested with reconstructed weapons. The Macedonian engineer Ctesibius of Alexandria designed a bronze spring catapult that used compressed bronze springs as the tension element, a device that required metallurgical understanding of spring temper and rebound properties. Number 56. The pre-electric illumination of exhibition buildings. There is a category of evidence within the historical record of the great exhibition buildings of the 19th century that researchers in the alternative history community have focused on with some intensity. The Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London. The Palace of Fine Arts from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The exhibition halls of the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876. These structures were enormous, beautiful, and photographed extensively from their first days of operation. The photographs show buildings with massive interior spaces lit in ways that contemporary accounts describe as extraordinarily bright. The Crystal Palace covered 39 hectares and had glass walls and a glass roof, which addressed daytime illumination, but contemporary accounts of events held inside in the evening describe the interior as brilliantly illuminated. The electric arc lamp was demonstrated publicly in the 1870s and became available for large-scale installation in the 1880s. The Crystal Palace and its contemporaries from the 1850s and 1860s predate practical electric illumination. They were supposedly illuminated by gas lighting. Number 57. The Polynesian navigation system and the ocean knowledge without instruments. When European ships first made contact with Polynesian navigators in the 18th century, those navigators were crossing distances of up to 2,000 miles of open ocean in double-hulled canoes without magnetic compasses, without sextants, without chronometers, and without charts as Europeans understood them. They were doing this reliably, landing on specific islands on specific journeys, knowing where they were going and how to get there. The system they used integrated multiple streams of environmental information simultaneously, the direction and height of ocean swells, the behavior of which is consistent over large areas and does not vary with weather in the surface wind the way wave surfaces do, the positions of stars across the full dome of the sky, memorized as a three-dimensional navigational framework, the color and behavior of clouds over islands that lie below the horizon, the presence of specific bird species at specific distances from specific islands, the temperature of the water, the patterns of phosphorescence at night, and the subtle current variations that indicated proximity to land. Number 58. The Chinese cast iron that predated Europe by 15 centuries. Cast iron that has been melted to a liquid state and poured into molds, requires temperatures above 1150 degrees Celsius to produce. This temperature was the limiting factor in the European development of cast iron production, which did not become technically feasible until the development of the blast furnace in approximately the 14th century AD. China achieved these temperatures using bellows-driven blast furnaces by approximately 500 BC and began producing cast iron at an industrial scale. Chinese cast iron production between 500 BC and 500 AD encompassed iron agricultural tools, iron cooking vessels, iron construction hardware, and iron weaponry, all produced through casting rather than the forging and wrought iron production that European smiths were using for the same period. The Chinese also developed steel production through the co-fusion of cast iron with wrought iron, a technique called the 100 refinings process, which produced a carbon-adjusted steel that was superior to either of its source materials. The knowledge of high-temperature iron metallurgy that allowed the production of these materials did not transfer to Europe through the Silk Road trade, despite centuries of contact. Number 59. the self-repairing roads of ancient Rome and the technology of the camber. The engineering of a Roman road was not accidental, and it was not static. Roman roads were built with a specific cross-section profile, in which the paved surface was highest in the center and sloped downward toward the sides, a feature called a camber. The purpose of the camber was to direct rainwater off the road surface and into the drainage channels that ran along either side of the road, preventing water from pooling on the surface and softening the substrate below. The drainage channels were typically cut into the bedrock or constructed from stone and directed water into the natural drainage of the adjacent terrain. The Roman road maintenance corps, the curatores viarum, was a professional organization responsible for the ongoing upkeep of road surfaces, replacing worn paving stones, regrading drainage channels, and repairing sections damaged by frost, flooding, or heavy cart traffic. Milestones placed at regular intervals recorded distances to major cities and the names of officials responsible for the road sections. Roman road maintenance contracts found in epigraphic records from the imperial period specify the standards to which repairs were to be made and the penalties for substandard work. The Romans did not simply build roads. Number 60. The hypocaust variant and the heated greenhouse of Roman Britain. When Roman administrators and settled veterans established estates in the provinces of the empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, some of them applied hypocaust technology to a use that goes beyond domestic heating. Archaeological evidence at several Romano-British villa sites, including the substantial villa complex at Fishbourne in West Sussex, has been interpreted as indicating the presence of heated growing rooms, spaces maintained at elevated temperatures through hypocaust-style underfloor heating for the purpose of cultivating plants that would not survive the British winter in unheated conditions. Pollen analysis from villa garden deposits at some sites has identified plant species not native to Britain that require warmer growing conditions than the British climate provides. The Romans imported and cultivated plants from Mediterranean and Middle Eastern climates, and, at least in some cases, maintained enclosed, artificially heated, growing environments to sustain them. The greenhouse, as a concept, an enclosed transparent or translucent structure, admitting light while retaining heat, was not formally developed in European horticulture until the 17th century, in the form of orangeries built for Italian and Dutch aristocratic gardens. Number 61. The Fuente Magna Bowl and the language in the wrong hemisphere. The Fuente Magna Bowl was found near the shore of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia in the 1950s by a farmer who turned it up while working his land. The bowl eventually made its way to the Gold Museum in La Paz, where it sat for decades, largely unexamined. When researcher Bernardo Biados and linguists Clyde Winters published a study of the inscriptions inside the bowl in 2002, the academic establishment declined to engage seriously with their findings. The inscriptions on the interior of the bowl are not in any South American indigenous script. They appear to be Sumerian proto-cuneiform, a writing system from ancient Mesopotamia, accompanied by what the researchers identified as a Sumerian language dedicatory text to the goddess Nia. If the identification of the inscription as Sumerian is correct, it represents physical evidence of contact between Mesopotamian civilization and South America at a date that predates Columbus by thousands of years, and that is not accommodated by the conventional model of pre-Columbian history. The conventional response to this identification is that it is either a forgery or a misidentification by researchers imposing a pattern they expected to find. The bowl exists and is available for examination in the Gold Museum. Number 62. The Coral Castle and the Method. Edward would never explain. Between 1923 and 1951, a Latvian immigrant named Edward Līdzkalnis, who stood approximately 5 feet tall and weighed approximately 100 pounds, constructed a series of massive coral stone monuments at two locations in Florida, the second of which, called the Coral Castle, he assembled at his property and homestead. The stones Leeds-Kalnin cut and moved included a 9-ton gate that swung open with a fingertip push, balanced on its pivot so perfectly that it operated without friction for decades before a shift in the underlying limestone required it to be reset by a crew with a crane. The single largest stone at Coral Castle weighs an estimated 30 tons. Leeds-Kalnin worked alone. He worked at night. He declined to let visitors observe his methods. When asked how he moved and placed the stones, he said he understood the secrets of the Egyptian pyramid builders and that he had rediscovered how the ancient Egyptians worked. Number 63. The Vimana texts and the flight specifications that should not exist. The ancient Indian texts, known as the Vedas, and associated Sanskrit literature, contain references to flying craft called vimanas that appear across a range of descriptions from the mythological to the specific. In the Ramayana, the Pushpaka Vimana is described as a craft that moves through the sky at the will of its occupant and can carry multiple passengers. In the Mahabharata, Vimanas appear as vehicles of gods and heroes across hundreds of passages. A Sanskrit text called the Vaimanika Shastra, claimed to have been channeled from an ancient sage by a mystic named Pandit Subbaraya Shastri in the early 20th century and published in 1904, contains detailed descriptions of multiple types of aircraft, their construction materials, their fuel sources, their operational mechanisms, and the meteorological knowledge their operators should possess. Aeronautical researchers at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore studied the aircraft designs described in the Vaimanika Shastra in 1974 and concluded that the described designs were aerodynamically implausible, that the aircraft described could not fly in the configurations given. Number 64. The Thornton Heath meteorite and the carved stone from space. When a meteorite fell near Thornton Heath in England in 1865, the recovered fragments displayed something that was not expected and that was not explained by any known geological or chemical process. Machine-made patterns. The surfaces of several fragments displayed regular, repeated geometric indentations that resembled, to the engineers and geologists who examined them, the marks of mechanical working. A similar case involves a small metal sphere found in a South African mine in the Wonderstone silver mine of the Western Transvaal during the 1980s, described by employees of the museum in Klerksdorp that houses several examples. The spheres are approximately an inch in diameter, made of a hard metallite substance, some with parallel grooves cut around their equators. The geological layer they were found in is dated to 2.8 billion years. The standard scientific explanation is that these are natural mineral concretions, that the geometric patterns and grooves are products of natural crystallization and banding in the mineral formation process. Researchers who study them find the regularity of the grooves inconsistent with natural formation. The spheres are hard enough that they cannot be scratched by steel. Number 65. The Roman watermill network and the industrial capacity nobody credits. At Barbegal, in the south of France, archaeologists have documented the remains of a watermill complex built in the 2nd century AD that consisted of 16 overshot water wheels arranged in 2 parallel channels descending a hillside, fed by an aqueduct branch that specifically served the mill complex. The total milling capacity of the Barbegal complex has been estimated at approximately 28 tons of grain per day, sufficient to supply bread for a city of 80,000 people. Barbegal was a flour factory. It was powered entirely by water. It was automated in the sense that, once the water was flowing and the grain was fed into the hopper, the grinding proceeded without human intervention until the grain ran out or the water was diverted. The Romans had water-powered industrial facilities. They knew how to convert the energy of falling water into rotational mechanical work through a geared connection between the wheel and the millstone. The Domesday Book of 1086, compiled for William the Conqueror to catalogue the taxable resources of England, records approximately 5,804 watermills operating in England alone, suggesting that the Roman watermilling tradition had been maintained and expanded in the early medieval period. Number 66. The magnetic compass and the thousand-year head start, China was never given credit for. The magnetic compass was in use in China for geomantic divination, the practice of feng shui, from at least the 4th century BC, with what may be an earlier precursor described as early as the 11th century BC in records from the Zhou dynasty. The instrument used for this purpose was called a sinan, and it consisted of a spoon-shaped piece of lodestone, a naturally magnetized iron ore, balanced on a highly polished bronze plate in such a way that the handle of the spoon aligned with the magnetic south. The use of a magnetized needle floating in water for navigational purposes was first described in a Chinese text, the Dream Pool Essays of Shen Kuo, in 1088 AD. The magnetic compass appears in European records approximately a century later, first described by Alexander Nekham in England around 1190 AD and by Guillaume de Provence in France around the same period. The standard account of the compass's arrival in Europe treats it as an independent rediscovery or a transmission through Arab intermediaries from China. Number 67. The Sacsayhuaman Fortress and the stones that lock together in earthquakes. On the hill above the city of Cusco in Peru stand the remains of a massive stone construction that the Spanish, when they arrived in the 16th century, described in their accounts with evident astonishment. Stones of sizes they had not previously encountered, fitted together without mortar in a zigzag pattern of walls reaching 9 meters in height. The largest stones at Sacsayhuaman weigh an estimated 360 tons. The fitting of the stones is not simply tight. The contact surfaces of adjacent stones are shaped to interlock, with projections from one stone fitting into corresponding recesses in the next, in a way that makes the overall wall structure more resistant to the lateral forces of an earthquake than a wall of flat-faced stones would be. The Andean region is one of the most seismically active on Earth. Cusco has been struck by major earthquakes repeatedly in the historical period. The colonial Spanish buildings constructed on and around the original Inca foundations have been damaged and required reconstruction multiple times. The Inca stonework beneath them, including the street walls of the original Inca city that remain visible in Cusco today, has not required reconstruction. Number 68. The Baghdad House of Wisdom and what burned when it burned. In 1258 AD, the Mongol army of Hulagu Khan sacked the city of Baghdad, then the largest and most intellectually sophisticated city in the world. The House of Wisdom, the Bait al-Hikmah, that had served as the center of the Islamic Golden Ages, scientific, philosophical, mathematical, and literary production for more than 500 years, was destroyed. Contemporary accounts, many of them written by the survivors and their descendants, describe the Tigris River, running black with the ink of the books thrown into it, and then red with the blood of the scholars killed on its banks. The House of Wisdom at its peak is estimated to have held between 400,000 and 1 million manuscripts. What those manuscripts contained has to be inferred from the works that survived in copies made before 1258, from references in surviving texts to works that did not survive, and from the traces of knowledge found in later European and Middle Eastern scholarship that appear to derive from traditions originating in Baghdad. Number 69. The Olmec heads and the African faces in a pre-Columbian jungle. The Olmec colossal heads are 17 massive stone sculptures found across 4 sites in the lowland regions of what is now the Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco. The largest weighs approximately 40 tons and stands nearly 3 meters tall. They depict human heads wearing helmets that most researchers interpret as sporting or military headgear. The faces on the heads do not conform to the facial morphology of any indigenous Mesoamerican population. Researchers who have studied the craniofacial features of the Olmec heads in detail, including anthropologist Andrzej Wiercinski, who published measurements in the 1970s, have noted features including the broad nasal structure, prognathism, and full lip profile that are characteristic of sub-Saharan African morphology. The standard archaeological interpretation is that these features represent either a specific Olmec elite phenotype that does not survive in the modern population, or a stylistic artistic convention. Historian Ivan van Sertima published a controversial book in 1976, arguing for pre-Columbian African contact with Mesoamerica, and used the Olmec heads as one strand of a multi-source argument. His work was criticized heavily in academic literature for methodological problems. Number 70. The Dendera Zodiac and the Age that Pushes Everything Back. On the ceiling of the pronaos of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt, carved in low relief and now held in the Louvre Museum in Paris, is a circular representation of the sky, showing all the major constellations of the zodiac, along with the positions of the planets and the sun and moon. The Dendera zodiac is dated by Egyptologists to approximately 50 BC, during the Ptolemaic period, on the basis of the architectural context in which it was found. French mathematicians and astronomers who examined the zodiac in the early 19th century, after Napoleon's Egyptian campaign brought it to the attention of European scholarship, attempted to date it astronomically by determining which configuration of celestial bodies corresponded to the positions shown. One study by mathematician Jean-Baptiste Biot and astronomer Jean-Baptiste Fourier concluded that the astronomical configuration shown on the zodiac corresponded to a date of approximately 700 BC. A later analysis by astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, working from different assumptions about which symbols represented which celestial bodies, arrived at dates ranging from 4000 to 15,000 BC for different elements of the celestial configuration shown. Number 71. Ancient asphalt roads and the bitumen paving of 600 BC. The city of Babylon, under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BC, had paved streets. The paving material was fired brick set in asphalt, the naturally occurring bituminous material that seeps from the ground in petroleum-rich regions of the ancient Middle East. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon in the 5th century BC, described the city's processional way as paved with large stones, polished and even, surfaced with a mixture that gave it permanence. Bitumen-paved surfaces have been identified at multiple ancient Near Eastern sites, including the earliest confirmed asphalt road surface at Babylon, dating to approximately 615 BC. The properties that make bitumen useful as a road binder, its adhesion to stone, its flexibility under thermal cycling, its impermeability to water, its load distribution under traffic, are the same properties that make modern asphalt concrete, the dominant road paving material in the 20th and 21st centuries. When Scottish engineer John Loudon Macadam developed the macadam road surface in the early 19th century, he was not using bitumen binder, and his roads were not waterproof. Number 72. The geodetic knowledge of ancient Egypt and the prime meridian of the ancients. The Great Pyramid of Giza sits at a position that several researchers, beginning with the astronomer Charles Piazzi Smith in the 19th century, have identified as significant in terms of geodesy, the measurement and mapping of the Earth. The pyramid is positioned at 29 degrees, 58 minutes north latitude, which is approximately 6 minutes of arc south of the 30th parallel. It sits at a longitude that, in the measurement system of the ancient Egyptians, as reconstructed by researchers, may represent a deliberately chosen reference point for their geographical knowledge. Researcher Jim Allison has mapped a great circle route from the Great Pyramid through multiple ancient sacred sites around the globe and found that many of these sites fall within a small margin of error on a single great circle. A different analysis by Gary Osborne and others has proposed that the Giza pyramids encode a precise value for the circumference of the Earth. The mainstream archaeological position is that the Egyptians did not possess geodetic knowledge sufficient to make these correlations intentional. Number 73. The Antikythera mechanism's missing pieces and what the rest of the ship held. The bronze fragments recovered from the Antikythera shipwreck in 1900 that constituted the Antikythera mechanism represent, at best, a partial recovery of the original device. Modern analysis suggests that the surviving fragments account for approximately 1/3 of the original mechanism, with the remaining 2/3 still at the bottom of the sea, not recovered by the 1900 sponge divers or lost to corrosion over the 2,000 years the device sat on the seabed. The ship itself was carrying, in addition to the mechanism, one of the largest collections of Greek bronze statuary ever recovered, indicating it was either a cargo of plundered art or a collection assembled for a wealthy patron, possibly from the court of a Hellenistic king. The other instruments, tools, or devices that may have been carried on the same ship have not been identified. The mechanism itself is so far in advance of what the historical record suggests should have existed in the period of 100 BC that researchers studying it have repeatedly asked the same question: who made it? The most frequent attribution is to the astronomer Hipparchus, who is known to have worked from Rhodes, close to the likely origin point of the device. Number 74. The Lost Library of Ivan the Terrible and the Books That Vanished. When Ivan the Terrible, Tsar of Russia, died in 1584, his private library, known as the Liberia, or the Golden Library, disappeared from the historical record. The library was reputed to contain hundreds of manuscripts in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and other languages, collected across decades by Ivan and his predecessors. The collection reportedly included texts that had been removed from Constantinople before its fall in 1453. Texts brought to Russia by Sophia Palaiologina, the Byzantine princess who married Ivan III of Russia in 1472, and is said to have brought with her a significant portion of what remained of the Byzantine imperial library. The Liberia has been sought for centuries. It has been reported by multiple independent sources across different historical periods to be hidden somewhere beneath the Kremlin or beneath the streets of Moscow in a network of medieval underground vaults. Excavations and ground-penetrating radar surveys have been conducted without a definitive result. Number 75. The Free Energy Hypothesis and the Architecture of Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla's work on wireless energy transmission reached its most ambitious expression in the Wardenclyffe Tower project, begun in 1901 on Long Island, New York. Tesla intended Wardenclyffe as the first in a global network of towers that would transmit electrical energy through the Earth and atmosphere to any receiver equipped to capture it, anywhere on the planet, without wires. J.P. Morgan financed the initial construction. When Morgan understood that the system, if it worked, would make it impossible to meter energy consumption and therefore impossible to charge for electricity, he withdrew his funding. The tower was demolished for scrap in 1917. The researchers who connect Tesla's work to the Tartaria hypothesis propose that the transmission of electrical energy through the Earth and atmosphere was not a new idea in 1901. They propose it was rather a recovery. That the star forts, the obelisks, the spires and domes and towers that appear throughout the architectural record of what they call the Old World civilization were not defensive or ceremonial structures, but functional components of a global energy transmission system that Tesla had, through his own independent genius, partially reconstructed from first principles. Number 76. The pre-Columbian metallurgy of the Tumbaga alloy. Tumbaga is a gold-copper alloy that was the primary metalworking material of multiple Mesoamerican and South American civilizations from at least 500 AD onward. The alloy contains varying proportions of gold and copper, ranging from less than 5% gold to more than 90% gold, with the specific ratio adjusted for the intended purpose of the finished object. Copper-rich tumbaga was used for bulk castings and structural components. Gold-rich tumbaga was used for fine decorative work. The most sophisticated product of tumbaga metallurgy was a surface treatment technique that pre-Columbian smiths called depletion gilding. By treating a finished tumbaga object with plant acids that selectively dissolved the copper from the surface layer of the alloy, the smiths could produce an object that appeared to be solid gold with a pure gold surface, despite being composed mostly of the cheaper alloy. The technique required an understanding of the different chemical behaviors of gold and copper in acidic environments that modern analytical chemistry would frame in terms of relative electronegativity and solubility. The pre-Columbian smiths arrived at this understanding through a tradition of experimental practice spanning generations. Number 77, the ancient seismograph network and the earthquake data nobody kept. The seismoscope of Zhang Heng, described earlier on this list, was not a single instrument. Zhang Heng built multiple examples, and the court of the Han Dynasty operated a network of observation stations across the empire's territory. Each station was, in theory, equipped to detect and report seismic activity from its region. Whether this network actually constituted a systematic earthquake monitoring system with reporting protocols and data accumulation is not established by the surviving records. But the concept, an instrument distributed across a territory, each providing directional information about seismic events, constitutes the functional logic of a seismic monitoring network. The Chinese Imperial Astronomical Bureau, which was responsible for maintaining the calendar, predicting eclipses, and interpreting celestial omens, would have been the natural administrative home for such a network, since earthquake records were considered cosmologically significant and were integrated into imperial historical records. Chinese historical records do contain earthquake data stretching back to approximately 1800 BC, making the Chinese seismic record one of the longest continuous geological datasets in the world. Number 78. The megalithic yard and the standard of measure across 3,000 miles. Alexander Thom was a Scottish engineer and Oxford professor who spent the decades after the Second World War surveying megalithic sites across Britain and France with the precision of an engineer, applying modern measurement methodology to structures that had previously been studied primarily by archaeologists working with less exacting tools. What he found, published in a series of papers and books from the 1950s through the 1970s, was that a consistent unit of measurement, which he called the megalithic yard and calculated at 2.722 feet, appeared to be used in the planning and construction of megalithic monuments from the Orkney Islands in the far north of Scotland to the Carnac alignments in Brittany, a distance of approximately 1,000 miles, spanning a period of construction from approximately 3,500 to 1,500 BC, a span of 2,000 years. The consistency of the unit across this geographic and temporal range implies either a connected tradition of measurement shared across all the communities that built these structures, or an astonishing coincidence of independent convergence on the same unit length. Thom's methodology and his data have been reviewed, criticized, revised, and partially reproduced by subsequent researchers. Number 79. The crystal skulls and the optical properties of hand-carved quartz. The Mitchell-Hedges skull, allegedly found at the Mayan ruins of Lubantun in Belize in 1924 by Anna Mitchell-Hedges, the daughter of British adventurer F.A. Mitchell-Hedges, is the most thoroughly analysed of the approximately 12 crystal skulls that have been identified as potentially ancient artifacts rather than modern carvings. The skull is carved from a single piece of clear quartz crystal and is approximately human skull size. It is made in two pieces, the upper skull and a detachable jaw, which is unusual among crystal skulls. Hewlett-Packard Laboratories in California analyzed the Mitchell-Hedges skull in 1970 and found that the optical axis of the quartz crystal was oriented with the face of the skull in a way that would have required either extraordinary skill or knowledge to achieve if the carver was starting from a raw crystal rather than a pre-oriented blank. They also found that the carving showed no evidence of the rotary tool marks characteristic of modern lapidary work. The surface was polished to an optical quality that the HP engineers described as technically extraordinary. They estimated that it had required 300 years of handwork to produce, working only with harder crystal fragments as abrasive. Number 80. The ancient world maps and the cartographic knowledge that predates the voyages. The Piri-Reis map of 1513 is the most famous example of a category of historical cartographic documents that researchers in the alternative history tradition have studied as possible evidence of a lost global civilization with accurate geographical knowledge. Other examples include the Oronteus Phineus map of 1531, which shows a large southern continent in the approximate position of Antarctica, with river systems suggesting an ice-free coastline, and the Boache map of 1737, which appears to show the Antarctic continent had divided by a strait in a configuration that matches the subglacial topography of the continent as revealed by modern seismic surveys. Charles Hapgood, who was a professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire and not a professional cartographer, published his analysis of these maps in Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings in 1966. He argued that the maps showed evidence of a source cartographic tradition of extreme antiquity that had accurate knowledge of coastlines in their ice-free state, predating the continental ice sheet that now covers them. Hapgood's methodology has been criticized and his conclusions rejected by mainstream cartographic history. Number 81. The pre-electric streetlights of European cities and the gaslit explanation that does not quite fit. Among the photographs that researchers in the Tartaria and mudflood communities circulate as potential evidence of pre-reset technology are images of European and American cities taken in the 1850s and 1860s that show large ornate street lanterns mounted on decorative cast iron poles at regular intervals throughout city centers. The standard explanation is that these were gas lanterns, fueled by coal gas delivered through underground pipes from municipal gasworks, and that the municipal gaslight networks of major European cities were indeed built throughout the first half of the 19th century. Paris had gas street lighting from 1820, London from 1812. The technology was real, functional, and widespread. The question that some researchers have raised is not whether gas lighting existed, but whether the grandeur of the lantern infrastructure visible in historical photographs. The ornate poles, the multi-arm lamp standards, the architectural quality of the fixtures is consistent with a technology installed fresh by a developing 19th century industrial society, or whether it suggests an existing infrastructure that was converted to gas supply from a previous fuel source. Number 82. The Book of Enoch and the Technological Vocabulary of Angels. The Book of Enoch is a Jewish religious text that was excluded from the biblical canon by both the Council of Jamnia in approximately 90 AD and the later Christian councils that standardized the biblical text. It survives in full only in the Ge'ez language of Ethiopia, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, with partial Greek and Aramaic fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, confirming its existence and circulation in Judea before the Common Era. The text describes, in considerable detail, the activities of a category of beings called the Watchers, who descended from the sky to earth, taught human beings a range of arts and sciences, and produced offspring with human women. The arts attributed to the Watchers in the text include metallurgy, the forging of weapons and armor, cosmetics, astrology, the knowledge of roots and medicines, enchantments, and the reading of omens from celestial bodies. Researcher Andrew Collins and others who study ancient texts for evidence of advanced prehistory have pointed to the specificity of the Watcher's technological curriculum as significant. The text does not describe supernatural gifts. It describes technology. Transfer dot. Number 83. The Roman dodecahedra and the object with no official purpose. In Roman archaeological sites across northern Europe, particularly France, Belgium, Germany, Luxembourg and Switzerland, approximately 110 examples of a bronze object have been found that no scholar has been able to conclusively identify. The object is a hollow dodecahedron, a 12-faced polyhedron with a circular hole of a specific diameter in each face, and small spherical projections at each of the 20 vertices. The faces are not all the same size, and the holes in the faces are not all the same diameter. The objects range in size from about 4 centimeters to about 11 centimeters across. They date from the 2nd to 4th century AD. They are found almost exclusively in the northern provinces of the Roman Empire, not in Italy or the Eastern Mediterranean. They appear always in the context of high-status finds, in temples, in buried hoards, in wealthy households. They have been proposed as candle holders, as surveying instruments for measuring the angle of the sun at specific calendar dates, as knitting gauges for producing Roman military gloves in standard finger sizes, as rangefinders, as religious objects, and as toys. Number 84. The lost techniques of stained glass and the chemistry of medieval light. The stained glass windows of the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe contain colors that modern glass manufacturers, using 21st century analytical chemistry and industrial production techniques, have struggled to reproduce with full fidelity. The red glass of the windows at Chartres Cathedral, constructed primarily in the 12th and 13th centuries, contains a quality of depth and luminosity that is created by the specific way in which the coloring agent, copper oxide in various states of oxidation, is distributed through the glass matrix during the blowing and cooling process. Modern reproductions of Chartres red glass have been made by researchers using reconstructed recipes and period techniques and found to be visually close but not identical to the original. The deep blue glass of medieval windows uses cobalt as a coloring agent, but the specific shade of medieval cobalt blue depends on the trace mineral content of the silica used, which in turn depends on the specific sand source, which for the medieval glassmakers of northern Europe was frequently the riverbeds of specific regions whose mineralogy is not precisely documented. Number 85. The Great Zimbabwe. Soapstone birds and the kingdom nobody taught you about. The ruins of the medieval city of Great Zimbabwe, in what is now the country of Zimbabwe, are the largest ancient stone structures south of the Sahara Desert, covering an area of approximately 800 hectares and constructed without mortar from dry-laid granite blocks. The great enclosure, the largest single structure, has a wall 36 meters in circumference, 5 meters thick at its base, and 11 meters high, built from approximately 1 million hand-dressed granite blocks. The city was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe from approximately 1100 to 1450 AD, a state that controlled much of the gold trade between the interior of southern Africa and the Swahili coast ports, which in turn connected to the Indian Ocean trade network linking Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and China. Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery, and Arabian coins have been found in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, documenting this trade connection in the physical record. When European colonists arrived in southern Africa in the 19th century and found Great Zimbabwe, the response of the colonial administration was not archaeological curiosity. It was denial. Number 86. The Aqueduct of Segovia and the Roman engineering that needed no mortar. The aqueduct that brought water to the Roman city of Segovia in what is now Spain, was built in the 1st century AD, runs for approximately 15 kilometers from its source in the Sierra de Guadarrama Mountains, and includes a section of double-tiered arches crossing the valley at the edge of the modern city that stands 29 meters at its highest point, consists of 167 arches, and is built entirely without mortar. The stones of the Segovia aqueduct are fitted against each other by weight and friction alone. 1,700 and some years of thermal cycling, seismic activity, weather, and the vibration of modern vehicle traffic have not dislodged them. The precision with which the stones were cut to achieve a stable, mortar-free structure across 2 tiers of arches is a product of the Roman stonemasonry tradition at its highest development. The system was still in active use as a water supply for the city of Segovia in the 20th century, having functioned continuously for approximately 19 centuries. The medieval administrative authorities of Segovia repaired damage to the aqueducts and twice in recorded history, both times after human vandalism rather than structural failure. Number 87. The astronomical clock of Prague and the knowledge it was built to hold. The horloge, the astronomical clock mounted on the south face of the Old Town Hall in Prague, has been operating continuously since 1410. It is the 3rd oldest astronomical clock in the world and the oldest that is still functioning. The clock shows the movement of the sun and moon through the zodiac, the time in multiple systems including Old Czech time, German time, and Babylonian time, the current zodiacal sign, the current phase of the moon, and the rising and setting times of the sun. Once per hour, figures of the 12 apostles appear in windows above the clock face and pass in procession before a central figure of Christ, while the allegorical figures of vanity, greed, death, and a Turk move below. The construction of a clock of this complexity in 1410, using gear trains and cam mechanisms to model the movements of celestial bodies and synchronize them with a mechanical performance program, represents an application of mechanical engineering at the boundary of what is achievable with the metalworking technology of the early 15th century. Number 88. The Bimini Road and the structure under the Bahamas. In 1968, a diver named J. Manson Valentine found, in approximately 6 meters of water off the coast of North Bimini in the Bahamas, a roughly linear arrangement of large flat limestone blocks approximately half a mile long. Valentine, who was a friend of Edgar Cayce enthusiasts, noted that Cayce, the American psychic known as the Sleeping Prophet, had predicted in 1938 that ruins of the ancient continent of Atlantis would be found near the island of Bimini in 1968 or 1969. The discovery of the Bimini Road in 1968, the year Cayce specified, produced considerable excitement in alternative history circles and considerable skepticism in geological and archaeological circles. Geologists who have studied the Bimini Road have generally concluded that it is a natural beach rock formation, a type of limestone deposit that forms on sandy beach surfaces as calcium carbonate precipitates around sand grains and organic material, and that the regular rectangular appearance of the blocks is a product of a jointing pattern natural to this type of rock formation. Number 89. The Tiwanaku calendar and the age that precedes the civilization. The ruins of the city of Tiwanaku, near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, contain, at the Sun Gate structure, a carved calendar frieze that has been studied by multiple researchers attempting to determine the astronomical date it encodes. Arthur Poznansky, a German-Bolivian engineer who spent decades studying Tiwanaku, beginning in the late 19th century, published a detailed analysis in 1943, arguing that the astronomical alignments of the city's major structures indicated a construction date of approximately 15,000 BC, a date that placed Tiwanaku in an era before any civilization is supposed to have existed. Poznansky's methodology has been criticized and his dating rejected by mainstream archaeology, which assigns Tiwanaku's major construction phase to between 500 and 900 AD. More recent researchers, including Oswaldo Rivera and Neil Steed, have argued for intermediate dates in the range of 10,000 BC based on reanalysis of the astronomical alignments. What is not disputed is that the calendar frieze contains astronomical information of considerable sophistication, including data on the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle of approximately 26,000 years. Number 90. The Voronezh spheres of Russia and the machined stone from nowhere. In the western Siberian region of Russia, near the Volga River basin, in deposits of Jurassic period sedimentary rock, researchers have documented the existence of stone spheres of varying sizes that display properties inconsistent with natural geological formation. Unlike the famous stone spheres of Costa Rica, which are made from granite and have been accepted as human-made artifacts from approximately 300 to 800 AD, the Russian spheres are composed of a dolomite or iron ore matrix and are found embedded in geological layers dated far beyond the existence of any proposed human civilization. The spheres range from centimeter scale to several meters in diameter. Some display flat machined surfaces. Some display geometrically regular internal structures visible in fractured specimens. The conventional geological explanation is that these are septarian concretions, a well-documented natural phenomenon in which minerals precipitate in concentric layers around a nucleus in marine sediments, producing rounded forms that can display internal geometric patterning related to the crystallographic structure of the minerals involved. Number 91. The Roman dodecahedra as astronomical instruments. Of the many proposed explanations for the hollow bronze Roman dodecahedra discussed earlier on this list, one deserves a more detailed examination. Engineer Emilia Sparavigna of the Politecnico di Torino published a paper in 2012 proposing that the Roman dodecahedra were used as instruments for determining the date of the spring and autumn equinoxes, the 2 days of the year when the sun rises due east and sets due west, and when day and night are of equal length. Sparavigna's proposal was that the dodecahedron was used by holding it so that sunlight passed through 2 of the circular holes simultaneously, with the horizon visible through both openings. Because the holes are of different sizes, achieving simultaneous illumination through 2 specific holes at the same time of day would only be possible when the sun was at a specific angular altitude, corresponding to the equinox date. The calculation that connects the specific hole sizes of individual dodecahedra to specific latitudes in Northern Europe is mathematically sound, and different dodecahedra with different hole sizes would be calibrated for different latitudes, which is consistent with their distribution across Northern Europe at specific latitudes. Number 92. The architecture of the Old World exhibition buildings and the question of origin. The enormous exhibition buildings of the mid to late 19th century, the Crystal Palace of 1851, the Palais du Trocadero of 1878, the Transportation Building of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the exhibition halls of Vienna in 1873 and Philadelphia in 1876, share several architectural characteristics that researchers in the alternative history community have catalogued as a pattern. They were built extraordinarily quickly, with construction times measured in months, rather than the years that their scale would suggest. They were built with materials, particularly in the case of the Crystal Palace's prefabricated cast iron and plate glass, that represented the absolute leading edge of industrial production capacity at the time. They featured ornate architectural details, towers, domes, minarets, and elaborate facade decorations that are difficult to account for as purely functional additions to what were ostensibly industrial exhibition spaces, and they were, in many cases, demolished within decades of their construction, leaving little physical evidence of how they were actually built. Number 93. The Siberian permafrost artifacts and the things that should not be there. Siberian permafrost has preserved organic materials, animal tissue, plant material, and human artifacts from the Pleistocene epoch and earlier periods with extraordinary fidelity, because the constant sub-zero temperature prevents the biological decomposition that would otherwise destroy organic material. The artifacts that emerge as permafrost thaws, through the natural processes of the taiga landscape or through deliberate archaeological excavation, occasionally include objects that do not fit the expected cultural context of their age. Among the documented anomalies are polished stone tools of unusual precision from sites dated beyond the accepted range of modern human habitation in Siberia. Cave paintings under permafrost at depths inconsistent with the cultural period to which their style would assign them, and occasional metallic objects found in context with organic material from periods that predate the development of metallurgy in the region. The mainstream archaeological treatment of objects that are out of place relative to their geological context is to invoke secondary deposition, the process by which objects from one period are physically moved into the deposit of another period, by water, frost action, or human activity. Number 94. The Grand Trunk Road of ancient India and the infrastructure that connected a subcontinent. The Grand Trunk Road runs approximately 2,500 kilometers from Chittagong in modern Bangladesh to Kabul in modern Afghanistan, through the heart of the Indian subcontinent. The origins of the road are attributed to the Maurya Empire under Chandragupta Maurya, who built an administrative highway from the Ganges Plain to the northwest frontier in approximately 300 BC. The road was expanded and improved by the Suri Empire under Sher Shah Suri in the 16th century, who planted shade trees at regular intervals, built wells and rest houses at intervals of every few miles, and established a system of postal relay stations that allowed official communications to travel the length of the road in days rather than weeks. When the British colonial administration took control of the Indian subcontinent and assessed the existing infrastructure, they found the Grand Trunk Road already there. They used it. They improved it. They paved sections that had been maintained as packed earth, but they did not build it. They inherited it. Number 95. The ancient Chinese seismograph network and what the records show. The historical seismic record maintained by the Chinese imperial bureaucracy, which we discussed in the context of Zhang Heng's seismoscope, extends backward in time to approximately 1800 BC and contains records that modern seismologists have found useful for characterizing the long-term behavior of fault systems in East Asia. The Chinese records describe earthquake events in terms of their perceived intensity, the behavior of ground and structures, the duration of shaking, and the area over which the event was felt. By converting these historical descriptions into modified Mercalli intensity scale equivalents, researchers at the Institute of Geophysics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences have been able to compile a statistical picture of seismic activity in China, spanning approximately 4,000 years. This dataset has been used to identify the return intervals of major seismic events on specific fault systems, to characterize the geographical distribution of strong shaking from historical events, and to identify seismic gaps, regions that have not produced major earthquakes in the historical record, but that geological analysis suggests should be capable of them. Number 96. The star forts of the Americas and the civilization nobody colonized. When Spanish and Portuguese explorers arrived in South and Central America in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they found, in addition to the living civilizations of the Aztec and Inca, a landscape scattered with abandoned or semi-abandoned stone structures that predated those civilizations. The peoples they found could often point to these older structures and say that their ancestors had not built them. The megalithic tradition of the Andes, the enormous fitted stone buildings at Tiwanaku, at Pumapunku, at the base layers of Cusco, represented a construction tradition that the Inca themselves claimed to have inherited rather than originated. When Spanish missionaries and administrators attempted to document the oral histories of the peoples they encountered, they found traditions that consistently described an earlier age, a previous civilization, a time before the present world when beings of different character had built the great stone structures. These traditions are found across pre-Columbian cultures from Mexico to Peru. They describe a creation event, a destruction, and a recovery by human populations who rebuilt on the ruins of something that came before. Number 97. The electromagnetic properties of Stonehenge and what the stones still do. Stonehenge was built in multiple phases between approximately 3000 and 1500 BC on the Salisbury Plain of southern England, using sarsen sandstone from approximately 25 miles to the north and bluestone from the Preseli Hills of Wales, approximately 200 miles away. The specific properties of the stones chosen have been the subject of increasing scientific attention. In 2016, researchers from the Royal College of Art published a study finding that the bluestones of Stonehenge ring like bells when struck, producing a distinctive resonant tone that may have been the reason for their selection and transport from Wales when equivalent large stones were available much closer to the construction site. The bluestones have a high silica content and a crystalline matrix that produces this acoustic property. Number 98. The Labyrinth of Egypt and the building Herodotus called greater than the pyramids. When Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, he described a building near Lake Moeris that he considered more impressive than the pyramids. He called it the Labyrinth and described it as having 3,000 rooms, 1,500 above ground and 1,500 below, of such complexity that without a guide, he said, no stranger could find their way through it. The building has been associated with the funerary complex of Pharaoh Amenemhat III at Hawara, where excavations have found the foundation plates of an enormous multi-room complex adjacent to the pharaoh's pyramid. 19th century archaeologist Flinders Petrie excavated the Hawara site and found that the foundations covered an area of approximately 28,000 square meters, which he described as consistent with Herodotus's description. The above-ground structure had been quarried down to its foundation level. The stone, removed and reused, sometime in the late ancient or early medieval period, leaving only the floor levels and the lower courses of the wall foundations. Strabo, who visited the site in the 1st century BC, described seeing 12 courtyards, covered walkways, and rooms decorated in the Egyptian manner. Number 99. The tectonic resonance theory and the global network of sacred sites. A body of research, developed across several independent traditions, has converged on the observation that the major sacred sites of the ancient world are not randomly distributed across the Earth's surface. They cluster along lines, along arcs, along great circle routes that connect sites from different cultures and different millennia in geometric patterns that are too regular to be coincidental, according to the researchers who have mapped them. The ley line hypothesis, first proposed by Alfred Watkins in 1922 for the British landscape, has been extended by researchers, including Bruce Cathy, who proposed a global electromagnetic grid in the 1960s and 1970s, and more recently by a growing community of independent researchers who use satellite mapping tools to plot the locations of ancient monuments at a global scale. The specific geometry proposed by different researchers varies. Some propose a matrix of straight lines, some a triangular grid, some a spherical harmonic pattern derived from the geometry of the Platonic solids. What is consistent across these independent mappings is the observation that the concentration of ancient sacred site construction along the proposed grid lines is statistically improbable under a random distribution. Number 100. The question that the reset could not erase. You have been here for several hours now, You have heard 99 things. Roman concrete that grows stronger in seawater. A steam engine built in the 1st century. A computer made of bronze gears before the year 100 BC. A city with indoor plumbing, older than writing, as we are told writing began. Damascus steel containing structures that the materials science community believed it invented in the 20th century. Roads that outlasted the civilization that built them by 1,000 years. Maps that showed an ice-covered continent before the ships arrived. An underground city built for 50,000 people by a culture that left no record of the tools they used to build it. Stones fitted without mortar to tolerances that modern machining struggles to match. A calendar so precise it tracked Venus to within a fraction of a day across centuries of observation. A global distribution of sacred sites built by unconnected cultures in patterns whose geometry is too regular to be coincidence. You could explain each of these things individually. Take any one of them in isolation, and the objections are available. The alternative interpretations are ready. The academic consensus has a position. But when you put them all in the same place, when you look at 99 different categories of anomalous technology and lost knowledge and impossible precision and sudden disappearance, all converging on the same conclusion, all pointing toward the same gap, all clustering around the same compressed period of loss in the same decades of the mid-19th century, the explanations begin to feel insufficient. Something was here before us, not in the sense of alien contact or supernatural intervention, in the most straightforward and human sense of that phrase. Something was here before us, a civilization, or something that functioned as a civilization, operating at a level of technological sophistication that our official history does not accommodate, distributed more widely across the globe than the official history acknowledges, connected to each other in ways that the official history cannot explain, and ended, or interrupted, or reset in a manner that the official history describes as progress, while the physical evidence around us describes as loss. The buildings are still there. The roads are still there. The foundations are still there. The astronomical alignments are still there. The chemistry is encoded in the surviving artifacts. The knowledge is preserved in the texts that survived the burnings and the floods and the deliberate suppressions. The pattern is visible from above, from orbit, from the kind of distance that removes the noise and shows the signal. The question is not whether this happened. The question is who you trust to tell you what it means. Sleep well tonight. And when you wake up, look at the world around you with the eyes of someone who knows that the story is longer than they were told, deeper than the textbooks go, and still unfinished. Because if the knowledge was built once, it can be built again. And this time, maybe, it will not be lost.